Commander is getting worse. The wacky cards, the janky decks, and the pure whimsy of the format formerly known as EDH are slowly fading away as that name does. A bit like the light behind a beloved old donkey's eyes as it lies bleeding out behind the barn, while a younger, stronger, more consistent workhorse takes its place. Yeah, that's a little bit dark, but it's also not far from wrong. Let's talk about the midrange-ification of Commander, why it's bad, and why Commander precons are actually creating a big problem. Most importantly, let's talk about how you can fight the good fight in the name of fun, individuality, and whimsy. But before we get to that, a big thank you to Void Monster for sponsoring this video. It's rare that I do partnerships like this, but I'm a really big fan of supporting both artists and businesses that make great products, and Void Monster ticks both of those boxes. They are a TCG accessories and apparel brand by magic artist Forrest the Mel. You know, the guy that did your favorite band Goblin Pirate. Void Monster releases a new drop every month, and this month it's the Red Collection, which is just perfect for my red burn Pauper deck. It has a playmat, a deck box, a card binder, and sleeves, and orders open in about a week. If this looks like something that you're going to like, there's a link in the description and the pinned comment. The drop has a week-long order period, so make sure you get them before they're gone by March 1st, 12 PM PST. Or be like me and miss their Devoid drop for your Eldrazi deck and live with eternal regret. Thanks again to Void Monster for not being mid and for supporting my ramblings. So speaking of that, let's get back to the topic at hand, mid-range. To truly understand the problem of midrange-ification, we need to start by winding back the clock to a time when combat damage still went on the stack and when half of the people watching this video weren't even alive, long before Commander was the most popular Magic format and the entry point for most into this game. When I first got my hands on Magic in the 90s, I was a much younger and bright-eyed kid in a small town in the middle of Africa. I was probably quite literally one of 10 people in my town that owned a Magic card. Kitchen table Magic at my childhood friend's house, where we were shepherded by his dad, rapidly evolved into standard games filled with wild mongrels, flame-tongue Kawus, and psychotogs. If you're old like me, then you know the joy of the Invasion and Odyssey blocks. This limited and constructed introduction to the game were critically important, because these standard decks taught us foundational knowledge about the game of Magic and how it works. Specifically, one thing that the Commander format is incredibly bad at teaching is the archetypes in Magic. My Blue-Green Madness deck was an aggressive tempo deck. I was playing out early threats and then control in the game with counterspells and bounce spells to get critical damage points through before my opponents could stabilize. My Psychotog deck on the other hand was all-out control. No creature could live and no spell could resolve, which was really tough to play against my friend's all-out aggro goblins deck. If I wasn't getting pile-driven by a little shit with protection from blue, I was getting domed by a CGN commander if I ran out of counterspells. The big point I'm trying to make here is that there was variance. Piloting my Madness deck into a Goblin deck was a very different experience from piling it into a Psychotog control deck. Sometimes you'd be heavily favored and sometimes you'd have almost no chance of winning. Highly different play experiences created by different decks that both taught us about the game, but far more importantly, made these games interesting and memorable specifically because of that variance. The game of Magic is ultimately at its core a convoluted game of rock, paper, scissors. And this dynamic is one of the things that makes the game interesting. In constructed formats, most players get bored to death by the dreaded mirror match, and I know I certainly do. Don't get me wrong, there is a lot of skill in navigating the smashing of two rocks together, but the necessary evil of rock versus rock, where you're playing against a copy of your own deck, is typically tolerated in a 60-card format rather than it being the selling point. Deck archetypes obviously still exist in Magic's now less popular competitive 60-card formats, but increasingly in Commander, we see less of the extremes and more of the middle of the road. Aggro and control take a backseat as everyone runs a deck that tries to do a little bit of everything, which is the definition of midrange. A strategy that aims to go not as fast as the aggro decks, nor as slow as the control decks, but instead operates somewhere in the middle, taking bits from each other archetype. A jack of all trades, but a master of none. There's definitely value in this strategy, but not enough that it should be the only strategy that's employed. As someone that builds Commander decks of all types all the time, I'll often get fairly opinionated pushback when I reveal a deck with a highly focused game plan. People will tell me that aggro can't work in Commander, because people have way too much life. Or that Voltron can't work in bracket 3 because you're just going to kill one player and then get taken out by the others. Or I'll get challenged that I'm not running any board wipes in my aggro deck, because how will I deal with it when my opponents inevitably play bigger creatures than mine? It's statements like these that made me first realize the damage that's been done and the lack of understanding many people have when it comes to deck building. I think there are a few reasons why newer players that entered the game via Commander may think this way, which we'll get to in a little bit, but it makes me sad when I hear statements like these because it's clear that people don't understand what they are missing out on, which is unique, interesting experiences. I will, as a disclaimer, point out that I definitely understand very well that Commander is a multiplayer format, and that obviously has an impact on how we play our game of rock, paper, scissors. But no matter what we do, scissors is beating rock, and rock versus rock still sucks. Aggro can definitely work, and those board wipes definitely aren't always needed. One just needs to build, an aggro deck with aggro solutions. And one needs to understand that not every commander can be an aggro commander, and we can't fill an aggro deck with cards that don't fit in an aggro strategy. The same is true for every other archetype. Commander is meant to be the whimsical side of Magic the Gathering, a place full of extremes, wacky decks and cards that don't survive in more streamlined formats, and where magical insane things happen that only a 4-player multiplayer singleton format can produce. Not a place where we all come together to play a highly repetitive and formulaic game that plays out in roughly the same way most of the time. Yet increasingly, that's what Commander is becoming for the average person, whether they realize it or not. It saddens me that I see more whimsy and variance in half the Pauper decks that I look at, or especially at a pre-release or draft in limited, than I do in most games of Commander. Coming to an LGS near you soon, it's going to be a homogenous mid-range summer. Speaking of summer, if you want yours to be even better, I cook up videos like this that help you think differently about Commander. Videos that will help you build better decks, play better, and have more fun. If you want more of that, like the video to tell the algorithm that you think it's good, and subscribe to make sure that my next banger gets delivered directly into your eyeballs. So clearly I think that this midrange-ification, or overabundance of midrange, is a bad thing and is causing problems. That it leads to less interesting games, less fun, and ultimately makes us worse Magic players. But the question is, how is this happening? Well, this is where things get really interesting. Let's start with the homogenization of card designs. I mentioned how back in my day we got some outright bad cards. Cards that if you opened them in a booster, you almost felt like you'd been cheated. But when you found a way to break one of those cards or make them do something unexpected, it felt like winning the lottery. I believe the most fun you can have in deck building in Commander and the most hype moments at the Commander table are usually tied to some obscure card or interaction that no one saw coming. Card design in Magic has in most ways become better and more straightforward. And while cards have more words than ever, the abilities on the cards tend to fall into narrower general themes than I think they used to. Themes like counter synergies or playing from exile synergies. I definitely don't blame Wizards for designing cards like this, because they no doubt want to design cards that people enjoy opening, and where there are mechanics that link together across sets. This is a very good thing for the average player, and being a new player and opening a new 1/1 counter synergy card from Lorwyn means you can use that in your Tidus deck that you built when Final Fantasy was released. If I was in Wizards' shoes, I would again be doing the exact same thing. All that said, it doesn't help in our Commander games, as this homogenized design brings everything closer to a stable, consistent middle ground. Variety is the spice of life, and in getting a more middle-of-the-road approach to design, we're getting one thing, consistency, but losing something else, whimsy. And when this is paired with the fact that we're increasingly getting lots of different cards that do similar things, which is a whole other topic and arguably problem, the singleton nature of Commander is challenged, and our Commander decks end up looking remarkably like constructed decks. Regardless of what type of product a company is making, if one tries to please the biggest possible audience, one ends up making a safer, more middle-of-the-road product. The iced latte, the milk chocolate, the Sabrina Carpenter. A formula that is wildly popular because it's nice and safe. But in doing only that, you also end up missing out on something like the Bad Bunny, which I would argue is a big downside. Much like midrange exists as a safe deck archetype for the general game, this midrange card design creates cards that are likely to be good and unlikely to cause problems. Take risks and you could end up getting Nadu. Now, all of this ends up creating more of an everything feels the same problem rather than an everything is midrange problem. And don't get me wrong, I do think that problem makes Commander feel very mid a lot of the time, but to get to the core of the mid-range problem, we need to talk about Commander precons. When I was thinking about how this mid-range problem came to be, I figured that the best place to start is at the beginning, or how new Magic players are being onboarded into the game in the year of our Lord 2026. From a mixture of personal experience and talking to a random selection of people, I know that it's a mixture of either seeing a Universes Beyond set like Lord of the Rings or Final Fantasy, or being lured in by friends. In both cases, most of the time the format that's being played is Commander, and the humble Commander precon is the first stop for most people. So I dived headfirst into this rabbit hole, hoping to understand how this mid-range plague was spreading, and found some very interesting things. This is the top 50-ish most played Commanders across the last 2 years on EDHREC. There will have been minor shifts since I did this research, but the gist will remain the same and true. Thinking about onboarding of new players and the info that I had access to, I figured it's much more likely that a new player builds a commander from a set that they've entered into the game with than they do an older one. So I looked at commanders that were released in the last 2 years. A staggering 24 out of 50 or 48% of the most popular commanders right now are new printings, a bunch of which are less than 12 months old, like Firelord Azula who came out near the end of last year. These numbers are staggering and genuinely surprised me because bear in mind this is total decks. Y'shtola came out in the middle of last year and has just shy of 33,000 decks on EDH Rec, whereas the Dragon, who's been around forever, has only 42,000. Whilst this was interesting, I wanted to take this a step further, because I do care after all about the people whose Magic experience is largely influenced by precons. If we then break this down again, we see that 17 of those 24, or 70% of these new most popular commanders are found in precons. That is a lot. I think this is a very big deal because it reinforces the idea that most newer players' experience when it comes to playing a deck or learning how to construct a deck is being heavily influenced by the anatomy of a pre-constructed commander deck. It's been a very long time since I was a new player, but if you're a brand new player to this incredibly complicated game and you're learning, then surely this official product should be how one is supposed to build a deck, right? If you're a newer player, I'd love your 2 cents in the comments about your personal experience and whether this matches up. So okay, a lot of the most popular commanders are precon commanders, but most critically, what does almost every precon have in common? They are built to a rough template, and the closest deck archetype that these templates hit is repeatedly mid-range. A strategy that has a little bit of everything, wants possible answers for most situations, and aims to win the game in the mid to late game through a mixture of control, card advantage, and aggression after the fact. Looking at precons that have been released over the last few years, even something like the Stellar Lee precon or the Y'shtola precon, which by all accounts you'd think should be control-focused spellslinger decks, are really mid-range decks when you analyze them. Now look, I understand why this would be. Decks like this gives people the tools to sit down at any table with their deck and have a reasonable experience in any game. If I was Magic, I would be building these decks in exactly the same way. And hell, even creators like the Command Zone or a random internet frog would tell you to build to a similar template to get started if you're new and you're building your own first deck. But therein lies the trap. Because this is a good place to get started, but is only the start of a long and interesting journey, not the destination. And too many think that the journey is done when they're actually still just in the starting town. By this point, you either think, holy shit, this frog is cooking with gas, or you've decided that you think I'm stupid and you hate me. Either way, feel free to let me know which in the comments. But if you're with me, let's talk about how to get out of that starting town, expanding our minds and getting closer to the endgame of Commander. To begin with, I would greatly encourage Commander-only players to get out there and try some other 60-card formats. I've said it before, but these formats will teach you so much more about the game of Magic than Commander does, and at a far higher speed than Commander can. And you'd be surprised at how friendly and warm these communities are. I would argue much more so than your average Commander pod at the LGS. Now, while some of these formats can be very expensive to get into, there are always good budget-oriented deck options in multiple archetypes that, whilst they won't win any pro tours, are more than good enough to see you have a good time at your LGS and maybe even win the odd LGS tournament. For Standard specifically, I regularly see MTG Goldfish publishing really good budget-oriented decks that you could have a lot of fun with. If, however, you want your foray into constructed formats to be all gas and no breaks, I cannot recommend Pauper highly enough. The best decks in the format cost like $50, and it's arguably the most fun constructed format I've ever played. In the last few months, I've spent more time playing Pauper than I have Commander because of that. Pauper glaze aside, these formats will help to teach you the skills to understand how to make deck archetypes other than mid-range function, and that can and will translate into your Commander decks. Outside of playing constructed formats, watching some competitive Magic Pro Tour will also start to help you to understand how Magic's decks, interactions, and archetypes function at their very peak, and this will help you get over the common misconceptions that I see many new players holding. Things like feeling like one has to be equipped for every situation in a game of Commander. I understand how that happens, but that's just a mirage. Take my old Commander enemy, Board Wipes, as an example and the tip of the iceberg. I've heard far too many arguments about how if each player has 2 to 3 board wipes, then the table will have an answer if someone rushes ahead. That sounds perfectly logical and reasonable, and the math kind of even holds up, because having 12 board wipes spread across the players in the game means that statistically, one player will have drawn one in the first few turns of the game. But what if the person that drew the board wipe is the person that's winning the game? Or what if the person that drew the board wipe has a really good reason for not resetting the board? There are far too many factors in a multiplayer game to rely on what other players may or may not have. Beyond this, our decks simply don't have the space to have a solution for every problem all of the time. And in including one thing, we're excluding or lowering our odds to get something else. I've talked about the anatomy of a commander deck and some of the maths behind it numerous times, which I'll link down in the description if you want to go and watch that. In short, building a focused game plan, whether it's aggro, control, combo, or midrange, is going to excel in some situations and fail in others. Embrace that, and your decks and your games will be far better off because of it. In embracing this, one has to be willing to lose, and sadly many are far too attached to the idea of maximizing their potential to win, but that's a whole other video. Were it not for this mentality of embracing focus, some of my most popular decks that I built over the past while like Lise, Vincent, or Stellali simply wouldn't exist. I'd never have attempted them, or they would be watered down versions of what they are and would fail because of that weakness. The main goal of this video is to make sure that you are aware of this trap, so you can start to work your way out of it or avoid it completely. And if I could leave you with one thought, it's that you don't know what you don't know. And typically, the more that one learns, the more you realize that you don't know, and this creates more humility and eagerness to learn. I see the situation with pre-constructed decks and mid-range decks in much the same way. This is definitely not a video telling you to never play a mid-range deck or abandon your precon, but it is a video telling you to see beyond that. A magic deck is a finite resource, and when one is brewing, one has a limited number of stat points that one can assign based on the cards we include. One can put them all into one category, or one can spread them out, and my message to you is that all the options are viable, not simply the one where you spread your stats out. I'll reiterate that Commander is supposed to be the whimsical side of Magic, and yet because of the way people are engaging with the game in the modern era, Commander is becoming ever more like a constructed format where people are chasing winning and consistency over whimsy and fun. Embrace the whimsy and your decks will ironically be better and you'll win more because of it. I hope you found this useful and would love to hear your takes down in the comments, whether you're a newer player or you're an experienced one with something to add. If you want to support what I do, smash up the like button or head over to my Patreon, and a big thank you to everyone that supports me over there. Lastly, if you want some personal tailored help, or you're just horribly rich and want to jettison some money, you can find that over on Ko-fi, all of which you will find the links to down below the like button. If you like this, go and watch one of these videos, you will probably enjoy them too, and as always, thank you for being here.